This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover One Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo Podcast. You are joining your normal host, Greg Thompson, who is flying solo again today for the next series in our offseason set of pods on the Buffalo Bills offseason. What we're going to be doing today in our second piece in this series is looking at the number of Bills that are coming up with their contracts expiring after the 2019 season. In the first piece in this series, we looked at a couple things that indicated how much of that $80 to $90 million in cap space that everyone keeps throwing around is actually usable. And we talked about some things about the cash spending floor, which shows that we are going to be cutting some checks this offseason, and the 30% rule, which impacts the amount of increases each contract can see going forward into the next CBA, and how that may eat into a little bit of the available money that fans are getting excited about. The next part that impacts how much of that money is actually available is what we're going to cover today. So after the 2019 season concluded, the Bills have 19 players whose contracts are expiring. That's a pretty average amount for the overall NFL landscape. That's a normal run for what most teams have in coming up from year to year. The good news for the Bills is very few starters are on that list. There's a few names that you'll obviously recognize as we go through here, but it's actually a pretty manageable list. And then a lot of that gets into how do those players fit into the future plans of the Buffalo Bills? What does Brandon Beane and staff feel that they represent from a value standpoint? And then does that line up with what the player and their representation feel that their value represents as well? So overall, again, 19 players represents a good chunk of the roster for what we saw last year, a full, almost 40% of what we're talking about on a 53-man basis. What we'll do is we'll go through piece by piece of where each of these are, and I broke them into some categories. So the first two are pretty easy. I put them under the category of pending retirements. The first being Lorenzo Alexander. This is simply a formality. He's formally announced his retirement, the reigning NFL Man of the Year candidate for the Bills, a great locker room leader the last 4 years in Buffalo, being a pleasant surprise, someone who was brought in under Doug Whaley and Rex Ryan to be kind of a special teams player and bit player, ended up having a breakout campaign with them and then re-signing for multiple years after that. And then coming back again this year, really growing into a great leader in the locker room and a unique player that played some strong side linebacker, a lot of special teams, some pass rush defensive tackle, and created a unique role that we'll get into later on in the offseason. I don't know that we're going to see a single player replace what he does. I think you can cobble together those snaps from multiple different players throughout the roster without needing it to specifically be one player that does all those different things. But I also think that at 37 years old, he had reached the end of that value, and that he brought more value to the locker room and the team than necessarily his on-field play was any longer. And certainly excited to see him stay a part of the community and a part of the team, and hope to have him be a voice around for those players. The second one is maybe a little less voluntary than Lorenzo Alexander's was, and that was Frank Gore. Now, I was a fan of the Frank Gore signing from a leadership standpoint, and I actually think Bills fans are going to see the dividends of that move in his mentorship for Devin Singletary for years to come. I think that anyone who saw the video I posted of them warming up in the Detroit preseason game and so many other clips after that can see that Devin Singletary became just a mimic for Frank Gore in his off-season preparation, his pregame warm-up, his approach to the game. And if that's something that he can take away from Frank Gore, I think we got our value in spades from him, and more so than what we could have wanted in that $2 million one-year deal. Early in the season, when Devin Singletary got hurt, I think some of those games that we saw the 17 carries for 109 yards against the Patriots, kind of salting away the lead against the Titans. I don't know that we win a couple of those games without Frank Gore. Unfortunately, down the stretch, 7 of those final 8 games, he had below 2.5 yards a carry. 5 of those games below 2 yards a carry. Several 1.5, 1.7 yard per carry games. And that's just not getting it done any longer. So I don't know that it's an absolute guarantee that he doesn't get an invite into a NFL training camp. I feel pretty confident it's not going to be Buffalo. I feel pretty confident that he's no longer going to be a valuable contributor to any NFL roster. And that's okay. He's had a long, illustrious career, going to end right now as the third leading rusher in NFL history, passing Barry Sanders and only behind Emmitt Smith and Walter Payton. It's an incredible career and longevity, and that I think he'll eventually find himself in the Hall of Fame. So wishing him all the best. Two great leaders stepping into retirement, but both players that I think we can replace as upgrades on the field, if not their leadership in the locker room. The next group of players is what's called exclusive rights free agents. And before I get into the names, I'll just explain that quickly. When a player is an undrafted free agent, they basically give NFL teams the same 4-year contract control that they would have if they were a drafted player. The only difference is those exclusive rights free agents, they get that as 2 years of exclusive rights free agency and then an additional year of restricted free agency after the initial undrafted free agent year. So they get it kind of as a series of 1-year contracts. The 2 years after their initial year of exclusive rights free agency is where they can be offered a minimum contract by the team who initially brought them in as UDFAs. And if they don't sign that, they cannot sign with any other team, and they have no leverage whatsoever. So it's basically the same idea as the team having a 4-year rookie deal at the veteran minimum. And the player can simply choose to accept that or to not play in the NFL. So it's a lot of leverage for the team. And the 3 players that the Bills have as exclusive rights free agents are Jason Kroom, Robert Foster, and Levi Wallace. I expect all 3 to be brought back into camp. Jason Kroom being that 5th tight end and someone who's shown some flashes of athleticism in the past, spent the entire year on injured reserve this past year. I don't expect him to make the roster, but I expect him to compete for it. And we've certainly seen surprises in the past. Robert Foster as a player who many saw with a great deal of potential coming off that rookie year and the second half of the season he had, that long touchdown bomb that he got from Josh Allen against the Jaguars will live in, fans' memories for a long, long time. Obviously had an incredibly disappointing season this past year, 3 catches for 64 yards on the entire season, despite playing nearly 20% of snaps and a great deal of special teams. Maybe he's carved out a role on special teams and can be kind of a break glass in case of emergency wide receiver. I don't anticipate that being the case, but again, he's got a shot to make this roster, although I think it's an uphill climb. Levi Wallace is one of the best values on the entire roster. I don't think that he's a great starting cornerback, but I think that he's a above replacement level cornerback, someone who is really valuable depth, and to have him at a veteran minimum contract this year as well as a restricted free agent next year is great value for the team. So I think that they're going to be able to have him locked up at a great value and then deal with his free agency 2 years from now after the 2021 season. The next is a restricted free agent, very similar situation with Isaiah McKenzie. The Bills claimed him from the Denver Broncos as a 5th-round pick coming off of that situation. He now moves into a restricted free agency. They have a couple different options with restricted free agency. You can put a maximum tender, which they then have to match with a higher draft pick. You have the original round tender, which is what I expect McKenzie to get, which would mean that if a team tried to sign him away, the Bills could either match that deal or get a 5th-round pick from that team. I think that's going to be enough of an incentive not to encourage a team to be able to try to poach him. I don't think that he's a roster lock. I think that he's got a reasonable chance, depending on whether the Bills draft 1 or 2 free wide receivers in this, potentially historic draft class, or whether they bring in 1 or 2 or 0 free agents at the wide receiver position, impacts him greatly. I think he's right there with the Robert Fosters and Andre Roberts and Duke Williams of the world in competing for a final roster spot, depending on how much competition is brought in behind Cole Beasley and John Brown. But I do expect him to be brought back. I expect him to be tendered, and I think the original round tender at a 5th-round pick makes the most sense. Another category that teams use from a contract standpoint are team options. The only one the Bills have this year is Spencer Long. It is a team option, not a player option. When the Bills signed him last spring to a 3-year, $12.6 million contract, it was actually more like a 1-year deal with 2 separate $4 million team options that the Bills can walk away from with very minimal impact. So when you look at that, John Feliciano's cap number is $3.65 million. Quinton Spain last year ended up having to settle for a $2 million deal. $4 million is a little bit steep for Spencer Long, but the fact that, realistically you'd be looking to cut him and bring him back at just slightly less than that, I don't know that it's worth it and risk losing him. I think he has some versatility. He can back up all 3 interior positions. So although $4 million is a little bit more than what I'd like to pay, if he was a $2 million backup instead of a $4 million backup, I think we'd feel a lot better about it. And if we were to lose Quinton Spain, he's a player that I could see us investing a 3rd, 4th, 5th round pick in a guard to compete with him. And Long might start the season as a starter, and we wouldn't be in terrible shape. So I think that he's worth having. It's a little bit of a luxury to overpay at $4 million for that kind of versatility inside, but I think it's worth keeping him around. I don't expect them to release him, but I wouldn't be shocked if it happened. It's certainly in the realm of possibility. The next category gets into 4 players who are all veterans. I categorize them as veteran minimum special teams depth. Those 4 names are Maurice Alexander, Sonoris Perry, Kurt Coleman, and Julian Stanford. Sonoris Perry and Maurice Alexander played almost exclusively only on special teams. I think there was a game where the Miami game where Tremaine Edmonds got dinged up and Matt Milano ended up missing a little bit of time. Maurice Alexander got picked on pretty significantly, so I think he exposed the fact that he's only a special teams player. He then got hurt late in the season and missed the rest of the year on IR. I think he was brought over initially as someone that, the special teams coordinator trusted, from his past history and wanted to bring him over, knowing his system and to be able to help implement Heath Farwell's, plans from a special team standpoint. And I don't know that he was a smashing success. I think that it's less likely he gets brought back. If he does, it'll be at a minimum contract. Same idea. Kurt Coleman, is a 30-plus-year-old safety that I think got passed up by Saran Neal and even Dean Marlowe in their ability to contribute as the 3rd safety. I think he was a nice safety blanket. I don't know that he's still a viable option to bring back again. I won't be shocked if he gets an invite, but I think he'd have an uphill climb for the roster spot. Sonoris Perry is, on paper a running back when in reality he is purely a special teams player. He did play the most special teams snaps on the roster once he was brought back in after being on the initial kind of IR injury settlement kind of situation to start the year. But once he came on for the second half of the year, he played the most special team snaps and the special teams got better after he was there. I would expect him to get brought back as an invite for camp. I don't know that means he's going to make the team, but you need guys who can do that. And regardless of what position you label them, what position they are on the depth chart, you need guys who can do that. And if they're better at that than some other player, it's not as simple. A lot of fans always get riled up that, why don't we, dress TJ Yeldon instead? Well, if TJ Yeldon is going to get no snaps on offense, which Sonoris Perry didn't, but is going to be worse on special teams, then Perry has more value on game day. So players like that matter more than what, many fans may realize. The 4th guy that I put on this list that I debated in this category was Julian Stanford. I actually think Stanford has a little bit more value than what some of the other guys are and can be the primary backup to Tremaine Edmonds. Obviously, we need Tremaine Edmonds to stay healthy. We can't afford for him to miss any time, and Stanford having to come in would be a problem. But I think anyone we brought in isn't going to be Tremaine Edmonds. So the fact that Stanford can be such a standout on special teams and still be a plug-in backup plan at linebacker, I think has some value. His contract's up. I do expect him to be brought back as well. I don't expect it to be a big number. Maybe it's a touch more than the veteran minimum, and instead of that, he gets $1.25 million or something like that, just as a nod to his veteran presence and continuity. But he's a player that I expect to be brought back as well and to be, a contributor to what we're doing. The next category I list is versatile positional depth. So the first player that comes up here is Adrian Waddle. We didn't really get to see what I think he could have represented as a value of a swing tackle and backup. He can play both left tackle and right tackle. I don't think he's a player that you want to rely on as a starter, but I think he's a guy who can play a spot start is needed. You know, if a guy goes down and Dion Dawkins misses a game or two, I think he can plug in without being an enormous liability. I think teams would come at him a little bit. I think we'd have to give a little more tight end help and a little more chipping on that side, but I think he can come in and play respectable football. Last year we had him at 1 year's $2 million. I'd love to bring him back at a 2 year, $4 million deal, have him there for the next 2 years. I think he gives some versatility and some protection that honestly I wish we had when we lost Ty and Secchi for those couple games there, where it would have been nice to have that as a backup plan. A player that I mentioned just a moment ago is Dean Marlowe. I think he played a little bit more than just special teams. He was able to show that he could be a big nickel third safety guy in a pinch. He's kicked around as part of Sean McDermott's defenses for 4 years now in Carolina and in Buffalo. I don't think he's ever going to be a guy that you're excited to make the roster, but I think he's got a shot, and that I've projected him to get cut for 3 years now, and he keeps beating that out. So I have a feeling 2020 is the year he finally loses out on that battle. I think that we see a small investment in the draft with another safety. We saw Jaquan Johnson step forward in a little bit larger role. We've seen Saran Neal play a versatile role there. I think we see another young guy come in to be a backup plan in case we're not able to bring back Jordan Poyer after 2020. And I think they'll beat out Dean Marlowe, but he's beat the odds multiple times prior to now, so he certainly got a shot. The third player I put in this category is Cody Luger. He was a guy who came over mid-season after being released by the Raiders and not getting into their plans. He was a decent mid-season acquisition. They played some nose tackle, played some 3-tech, some 1-tech. I don't think he's a starting caliber defensive tackle. I don't know that he made as much of a splash addition as when we picked up Jordan Phillips on waivers, but I think he did a nice job. So after Jordan Phillips got picked up, he got brought back the next year at $4.5 million on a 1-year deal. I don't think Lugia has earned that, but if we were to bring him back at $2 million, maybe even $3 or $3.5 million to be Ed Oliver's primary backup and a rotational fourth defensive tackle behind Oliver, Star Lotulelei, and Harrison Phillips, I'd be okay with that. So I think there's a chance we make a little bit bigger splurge in that defensive tackle market. But if we bring back Cody Luger at a low deal with very little to zero guarantees that become guaranteed if he makes the roster, I think that's a good bet for the Bills. And I think that that's a good backup plan in case they're not able to bring someone in free agency that may have a little bit larger impact. Now we're getting into the 4 players that were either starters or key rotational pieces that are up in their contracts. The first one I'm going to talk about is Kevin Johnson. So Kevin Johnson was a former 16th overall pick by the Houston Texans, played out his 4-year rookie deal with them. They actually initially picked up his 5th-year option, but then ended up releasing him prior to it being activated. And the Bills picked him up on the cheap, and they were able to bring him in at a very reasonable number, barely over $2 million. And that the 28-year-old who had major injury problems, he had only played in 19 of the possible 48 games the previous 3 years, averaging barely 6 games a year. He was able to play in every game. And he contributed snaps in every single game, either on special teams or both special teams and cornerback. And for the final 8 games of the year, he was playing half the snaps or more and played 100% of the snaps in the playoff game without being a liability. I do think they could bring in some cornerback depth in the draft. I do think that they're able to maybe play around in the free agent market, but I think Kevin Johnson earned a shot to come back here. I think he earned a raise. I project him to be brought back at 2 years and $10 million, going from $2 million a year up to $5 million a year. And I'm okay that if we go into next year with Levi Wallace versus Kevin Johnson as that cornerback opposite Trey White, that's a reasonable solution, especially if we draft a guy to come in behind them. So I think that's a spot where you're always going to have some versatility and some competitiveness. I think we could bring in a guy that competes both there long-term as well as maybe pushing Taron Johnson, who hasn't been able to stay healthy fully at cornerback, and that we have that kind of combination after free agency and the draft. So not out of the question we could try to upgrade there, but I think more likely that we bring him back to compete with Levi Wallace. The next name is Quinton Spain. So Quinton Spain, after starting 48 games in his first 4 years in Tennessee, did not find the free agent market that he or his representation had anticipated. Kind of waited it out, missed the first wave of free agency, missed the second wave of free agency, and a little bit later into that game, ended up settling for a $2 million deal with Buffalo, more so because he knew he'd have a chance to come in and start and increase his value. Well, he started all 16 games. He played every snap and didn't give up a single sack in the regular season. I think he might have in the wild card game. I would say he accomplished that goal. I don't know that playing 100% of snaps and giving up 0 sacks, I don't know that his play matches what that little snippet sounds like, where that sounds like a all-pro kind of season. He certainly wasn't, but he was good. And I think that he was a solid player. I projected that they would give him maybe a 3-year, $16.5 million deal, going from $2 million a year up to $5.5 million. Pretty similar to what we saw John Miller get from Cincinnati after he left the Bills. If that increases up to $6, $7, maybe $8 million a year, I won't throw a fit. If it ends up being 3 years and $18 million or 3 years and $21 million, I think that's reasonable. I think that he brought a lot of continuity to Dion Dawkins that was valuable. If his market gets beyond $8 million per year, I just think we have to step back and be able to evaluate, is that the right value of what we're looking for here? I think you may be able to let him walk. I think you could bring in a mid-round pick. I certainly like players like a John Simpson out of Clemson. I thought he looked great at the Senior Bowl. I think you could bring him in the 4th round and then have Spencer Long compete and not lose a lot there. I think that long-term, you probably could even have an increase in value over what that is. So my preference is that he returns. I hope he returns, but only at the right deal, and that I think you have to have the discipline to let him walk if that's the case. The next 2 names are the ones who've gotten the most attention so far this offseason. I'll start with Jordan Phillips. Very few players elicit the kind of emotional response from fans that Jordan Phillips does. There are several fans who adamantly want him back, and I get it. He's a guy who came back on a 1-year, $4.5 million deal, bet on himself, and put up by far the most impressive box score that he has in his entire career. 9.5 sacks, 13 tackles for a loss. That looks fantastic. I think that you can nitpick at the consistency, the efficiency, the run support, and how good that actually is compared to those maybe top 3 numbers that the sacks and the tackles for loss represent. But I don't think there's any doubt that he does bring an emotional charge to the team, and that his big plays are able to kind of build up what's going on in the locker room. When you look at what SpotTrack.com had, they compared players like Michael Brockers, Eddie Goldman, Malcolm Brown, Bo Allen, and they projected a 3-year, $18.5 million deal, averaging, $6.1, $6.2 million per year. If that's the range, sign me up. I'm ready for that. I'm okay with being able to bring him back around $6 million per year. I think it's a little high in what we would ideally want to be able to pay a guy who's going to, for all intents and purposes, back up Ed Oliver. But I think Jordan Phillips would be a nice luxury to have. I think he's a nice guy to keep in that locker room. I think there are pass rushing downs where you can have both Phillips and Oliver on the field that would make sense. But if the price gets anywhere beyond that, and honestly, I do anticipate it getting beyond there, I think that once again, Bean needs to have the discipline to let him walk and be able to, test free agency and sign elsewhere. And that's what I project to happen. I don't think we're going to get him back at $6 million a year or less. I think someone's going to pay for those sacks and tackles for a loss, and that many others have talked about, pass rush rate and the percentage of pressures versus how many sacks he got was incredibly unsustainable. He actually had the same amount of pressures that he did the previous year, where he had 2 sacks. And this year he had 9.5, and it was the same amount of pressures. And that most seasons with the number of pressures he had would lean a lot more towards the smaller amount of sacks. So it may be unsustainable, but I do think that he did have an impact on the team. I'd be open to bringing him back, but I don't anticipate that being the case. The final player we're going to talk about today is Shaq Lawson. This is by far the toughest projection of anyone on this list. Shaq is a 25-year-old defensive end. He had his best season of his career after 3 kind of mediocre seasons with a mixture of injury issues and misuse in a previous system. He really, he had the highest amount of pressures, hits, and sacks combined of any defensive lineman, more than Jerry Hughes, more than Trent Murphy, more than Ed Oliver, more than Jordan Phillips. Ended up with 32 tackles, 13 tackles for a loss, 6.5 sacks. But the issue is that it happened in a contract year. And I think any GM who uses the rule of don't sign anyone off of peak production in a contract year, you'd make more good decisions than bad. And I think it's fair to question if that peak production that he had was good enough for what defensive ends get paid on the open market. Because honestly, his career year is 6.5 sacks and 32 tackles. And is that going to match up with what Spot Track projects? Again, going back to their projections, they looked at deals that Henry Anderson, Robert Quinn, Matt Ioannidis, and Daquan Jones signed. They project 4 years and $30.7 million, averaging $7.6 million a year. If that's the case, absolutely. Sign me up immediately. I will, support that signing right off the bat. And if that ends up replacing Trent Murphy's deal, even better, because then it's a even swap of money and we simply have Shaq and could still go after someone else. What I fear is that there's going to be a team out there that scouted him coming out of Clemson, feels like there's another step of progression left in what he can do, and is going to be willing to go to $9, $10, $11 million a year. And if that's the price, then I just think that gets into the territory where we could upgrade him, where we could bring in somebody that, we'll talk about in a later pod in this series of kind of wish list guys on the defense that I think would be a better pass rusher. And I think you can bring in someone who's a really good run defender at a lower price. I don't think I want to pay $10 million for a really good run defender who in a career year has 6.5 sacks. So I would love to have Shaq back at the right deal. I think he's a good player. I think he's the kind of guy that Bean wants to show that they can call you out and have you step up and play well and earn that money to come back. I just don't know that that's going to be there, and I'm bracing for there to be a new name at that defensive end spot. So thank you for joining me today. I think that as, McDermott and Bean, stated in their end of season press conferences, continuity and bringing back as much talent as possible is critical to being able to step forward. The next 2 series or pieces in this series are going to speak to kind of my wish list on offense and defense. I'm going to try to be realistic. I'm going to try to show where I think some of the values are and what Brandon Bean has shown a propensity to do in finding pockets of value in the marketplace where he can take advantage of that. And I think there's some areas that they can do that. So you'll hear more from this first with offense and then with defense, but appreciate you guys listening to the Cover One Buffalo podcast. We are out.